Hi, welcome back. So in this first chapter, we'll focus on how personality is defined, conceptualized, studied, and the different scientific perspectives of personality. So personality is the study of the psychological forces that make people unique. Personality is psychologists are really interested in understanding what does it mean to be a person. So how are we unique as individuals and why are we unique? Why do some people seem to have an interest in math versus music? Or why are we inclined to perform in certain areas better than others? So personality psychologists try to understand these questions through systematic observations about how and why individuals behave and think the way they do. Personality has 8 key aspects, so that helps us understand the nature of the individual. So one key aspect is that every individual is affected by unconscious aspects. So we have forces that are not in the moment to moment awareness. So we might say or do things that our parents used to do or say, but we don't really recognize that they're motivated by our parents or motivated by our desire to resemble them. The second key aspect is so-called ego forces. So that provide a sense of self-identity. So for example, we often strive to maintain a sense of purpose or mastery. Third, a person is a biological being, so we all have our own unique genetic makeup that can determine our behavior and our personality traits. Then fourth, there's people are conditioned and shaped by the experiences and the environments that surround them. So our culture can determine our personality traits as well. Sometimes our surroundings and our environment trains us to respond in certain ways. The fifth key aspect is cognitive dimension. So thinking about and actively interpreting the world around you. Different people may construe the happenings around them differently. So not everybody thinks the same, and some people may interpret certain changes in the environment as something else, and from somebody else may interpret it completely different and therefore behave differently. The sixth key aspect is that an individual is a collection of specific traits and predispositions. So everybody has certain specific abilities and inclinations, and that could be due to both the environment and as well as the genetic makeup or your biological makeup. The seventh key aspect is that human beings have a spiritual dimension to their lives, which prompts them to ponder the meaning of their existence. So people are much more than robots programmed by computers. They seek happiness and self-fulfillment. The eighth aspect is the individual's nature is the product of the interaction between the person and their environment. So a person's genetic makeup is interacting with the person's upbringing from parents or caregivers, or even at school or work, or a combination of all of their environments. So taken together, all of these aspects are what help psychologists define and understand personality. Psychologists use different methods in order to assess personality differences. So one is using scientific inference, which is really based on insight. So this would be making observations and then drawing conclusions. So looking at the interactions between people at a bar, or looking at different cultures and then drawing conclusions based on the observations, and then collecting the data and determining whether it fits with your theory or not. The second is correlations, which is the degree of agreement between two variables. So a correlation is determining the relationship between two variables and also the direction of this relationship. A correlation is determined by the correlation coefficient. So that is assessing the strength of the relationship, which is the mathematical index that's used to assess the degree at which these two variables are in agreement. correlations tell us about associations. They do not assess causality. So just because the two variables are related does not mean that one causes the other to happen. They only tell you that they're related. So there's two types of correlations. There's positive correlations and negative correlations. So positive correlations are when one variable increases, the other variable also increases. If it's a negative correlation, that means that when one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So for a positive correlation, you could say, let's say extroversion and happiness were positively correlated. So the more extroverted somebody is, the happier they might be. For a negative correlation, you could say extroversion and shyness. So the more extroverted someone is, the less likely they're going to be shy towards others. So that's one variable increasing and the other variable decreasing. Then the third is systematic analysis methods. So usually psychologists look at case studies, which is intensively focusing on one individual, or they look at cross-cultural comparisons, where they're comparing multiple samples across different countries. So there's different approaches to understanding personality theories. So psychologists, some of them like to use the deductive approach. This is developed from fundamental postulates about the nature of the mind. The conclusions follow logically from premises or assumptions, and basic psychological principles are used. So this is really about taking a basic psychological law and then applying it to behavioral observations or the data. So you're kind of starting at the top and working your way down. The inductive approach arises directly out of systematic empirical research. So it provides a sense of the importance of traits. It's based on what carefully collected observations reveal, and it typically works from the bottom up. So you're working based on data up to the theory. So a lot of times in this approach, rather than taking a psychological law and applying it to the data, you're letting the data speak for itself. You're taking the data and you're conceptualizing based on what the data shows. There's analogies and concepts from related disciplines. So sometimes psychologists use functional magnetic resonance imaging scans or positron emission tomography scans, which are PET scans, that can also help achieve a better understanding of biological contributions to personality. It provides a more tangible way of assessing data, and a lot of times psychologists like to use this type of data and sort of relate it back to some psychological data. So using brain scans and then looking at people's self-reported data. The best and most modern understanding of personality comes from a synthesis of psychological research on such matters such as the nature of the self, psychobiology, learning theories, trait theories, existential approaches, and social psychology. So there are 8 basic aspects of personality. So one is psychoanalytic, which draws attention to unconscious influences, such as the importance of sexual drives, even in non-sexual spheres. The second is neo-analytic, or ego perspectives, which places an emphasis on the self as it struggles to cope with emotions and drives on the inside and demands of others on the outside. The third is biological, which focuses on tendencies and limits imposed by biological inheritances. This is easily combined with most other approaches. There's the behaviorist approach, which places more of an emphasis on scientific analysis of the learning experiences that shape personality. There's cognitive, which places an emphasis on the active nature of human thought and uses modern knowledge from cognitive psychology. There's traits, so this focuses on individual assessments, individual personality traits. There's humanistic existential approach, so that is based on the spiritual nature of a person, and this approach emphasizes struggles for self-fulfillment and dignity. And then there's the interactionist approach, which is the understanding that we are different types of people in different situations. So in order to understand personality, we have to understand these 8 perspectives. So we have to understand how biological factors account for personality differences. So how temperament is strongly influenced by multiple biological systems. And in order to understand how biological factors contribute to personality, we have to understand human genetics. So we know that people differ in their biological systems. An individual's characteristic, emotional, and motivational nature, generally known as temperament, is strongly influenced by these biological factors. We also have to understand behaviorist and learning aspects. This gives importance of radical behaviorist B.F. Skinner's research. So that his work examines the extent to which personality can be found in the external environment. We also have to understand cognitive aspects, which focuses on people's consistencies in perceiving and interpreting the world around them. And this is increasingly joined with social psychology into social cognitive approaches to personality. And then humanistic and existential aspects are focusing on people's freedom and self-fulfillment. And so that's another subject in the study of personality. Theorists, starting with Carl Rogers, examined what seems to make humans uniquely human, and further, what makes people happy and fulfilled. And so all of these perspectives are important in understanding personality differences. Because several aspects to personality have been backed up with research, you cannot necessarily rely on one approach. And because there are proponents of multiple aspects to personality. For example, Freud had many biological notions in his theories, and he appreciated the major role played by socialization forces. Whereas Skinner, which he was a behaviorist, well understood the tremendous influence of other people in our lives, despite his research focus on conditioning. And so each approach adds richness to our understanding of personality. It shouldn't be looked at as one or the other, but rather a combination of factors that influence our personality and our unique differences. Some roots of personality psychology can be traced back to the theater. So, for example, ancient Greek and Roman actors wore masks to emphasize that they were playing characters different from themselves. Pirandello toyed with the idea that characters could step outside the action of their plays. So, for example, a player could move totally off the stage and comment on the drama. So this got people thinking, is there really something fixed beneath the surface of the parts that people play in their lives? Social philosophers began considering the idea of a relative self, which means that there is no underlying self beneath an outward-facing mask, but rather the true self is comprised merely of masks. Personality can also be traced back to religion. So there's some aspects of personality in Western religions. Such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they assert that humankind was created in God's image and from the beginning has faced temptation and moral struggle, that people fulfill a divine purpose and struggle for good and against evil, and that people's nature is primarily spiritual, so spirit inhabits the body while it's on earth. Then there's aspects of Eastern religions. So Eastern religions emphasize self-awareness and spiritual self-fulfillment, and they played an important role in shaping certain aspects of modern personality theory. The theory of evolution is also important to personality psychology. The theory of evolution stresses that individual characteristics pass on genes to offspring, and they become more prevalent in populations over generations. Individuals that are not well adapted to the demands of their environment will not survive to reproduce. And a certain amount of aggressiveness and a certain type of social cooperativeness might prove adaptive. So the focus on function remains an important aspect of our thinking about personality. It's important because it frees thinking from assumptions of divine control. And so scientists have begun to study human behavior more systematically due to evolutionary biology. The first set of mental tests were intelligence testing in the Army, and they were developed under psychologists Lewis Terman of Stanford and Robert Yerkes of Harvard. They were used in Army tests and screening of school students to see who would become future elites of society and to see who could qualify in the Army. So this was to weed out people that didn't qualify for the Army, but also to look for tendencies of applicants to collapse under stress. Unfortunately, intelligence testing also set the stage for the use of bias tests to discriminate unfairly against groups least favored by test givers and who did not perform well on tests due to their cultural backgrounds. Intelligence and creative abilities are often separated from personality in the belief that they are more like skills, such as physical strength, than they are like traits, such as extroversion. However, to the extent that intellectual abilities are central to an individual's psychological makeup, they should be considered part of personality. There are several people that shaped modern personality. So for example, Gordon Allport, he devoted his attention to the uniqueness and dignity of the individual. He defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his unique adjustment to his environment. This was built on the work of psychologist philosopher William James. He rejected the idea of trying to break down personality into basic components and looked for the underlying organization of each person's uniqueness. Kurt Lewin, he came out of the Gestalt tradition in Europe. He emphasized the integrative and active nature of perception and thought. He looked for systems that underlie observable behavior, and he emphasized that the forces affecting a person change from time to time and from situation to situation. And then lastly, Henry Murray attempted to integrate clinical issues with theory and assessment issues. He believed in a comprehensive orientation, which included longitudinal research. He took a broader approach to personality. Certain issues continuously arise in the study of personality. And researchers are still interested in several questions in order to understand people's personalities and how it ties to their behavior. So first we have to ask, what is the unconscious? The unconscious is that we are influenced by internal forces of which we are not aware of. Generally, people believe that people are responsible for their own actions, which means that they act consciously, not unconsciously. And so we're constantly faced with this dilemma of conscious versus unconscious determinants of behavior. Next is, what is the self? In order to understand personality, we need to understand the self and whether the self is a complex chemical substance or is it some spirit that is inhabiting a body. What is the core of who we are? How important are social influences on the self, such as parental deprivation or excessive praise from others? These are questions that are legitimate issues in the field of personality psychology. And then lastly, does each individual require a unique approach? So because each person's biography is different and upbringing is different, modern research first studies each individual in detail and then uses common dimensions that emerge to study differences among individuals. Researchers are interested in looking at personality because it's a useful scientific concept for understanding human behavior. But we also have to ask questions about whether is it merely an illusion or is personality a misunderstanding of causality. There is some inner essence that makes us who we are, but unfortunately, lots of these notions of being a person or personhood are pretty vague and misleading. For example, lovers are often shocked to discover that their partner, whose essence they knew so well, actually had a criminal side. People are complex, and it's important that we avoid simplistic illusions or wishful thinking about a personality, as oftentimes behavior can be unpredictable and lots of environmental and social factors may influence our behavior. The multiple scientific techniques used to study and understand personality are used in modern research. So most current researchers are not constructing new grand theories, but they're rather working to answer applied questions, such as the role played by personality in physical health and sickness, and in marriage and divorce. For example, is there a disease-prone and a self-healing personality? So these are just some topical areas that are of interest in the modern research. During the 1900s, American psychologists were investigating in authoritarian personality, which is an excessively masculine, cold, and domineering personality type. At the same time, German psychologists were investigating the antitype, so people that are likely to be weak, liberal, artsy. And so what Americans called rigidity, the Germans called stability. So it's interesting in which culture plays a role in how people view one's personality traits. The ways in which observations about personality, it's interesting because they can be strongly influenced by the cultural context in which they occur.